Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to the latest Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies workshop. This one is on systems thinking in climate assemblies, in particular, what role for systems modelling. We've had a couple of sessions already around this issue of systems change, systems thinking. There was a workshop last year, in fact, which was led by Collste. On the question about whether assemblies can deal with issues of system change. And in that, during that workshop, one of the themes that emerged was, how do you facilitate systems thinking? And prior to that, we ran a workshop on backcasting and scenario planning back in 2022. Seems a long time ago now. Again, looking at how we might use those techniques. So when we were thinking about this area of work, we started having conversations with the people at the Stockholm Resilience Centre, who are developing a independent climate assembly in Sweden. And they come from a modelling background. And we had started having some really interesting discussions with them about how the world of professional modelling could come into, could speak to and work with the climate assembly community. And they've been wrestling over the last few months, and I mean wrestling, really. I think it's been tough work for them trying to figure out in what ways you can bring systems modelling into assemblies. And these are people who, as I say, are, this is their day-to-day work is with modelling. So these are people who know what the various options were. Now, we are going to have a learning call in a few months' time, maybe towards the end of the year or next year, around what happened at the Swedish Climate Assembly. But we thought actually it'd be really good for us to learn from them about the kinds of thinking that they've been going through in terms of, and the kinds of ways they've been thinking about this integration between modelling and assemblies before the assembly starts. So we can actually, as a community, learn a bit from their experience. So, what kinds of models would work? What could they work for? What kind of technological competence do you have to do in order to actually use these models? So those are some of the questions that we're going to be talking about today. The workshop will have a presentation, for about half an hour from three of the researchers from the Stockholm Resilience Centre, from Tim Dorr, from Sarah Cornell, and also from David Collste. And then we're going to have very quick response from two people who are very involved in this world in very different ways, not modelers themselves, but Claire Mellier, who was actually involved in that systems change workshop, who led that workshop, who is the knowledge and practice lead and co-initiator at ISWE and co-initiator of the Global Assembly. And then also from Martin Rausch, who's an international trainer and co-creator of participation projects, an associate of the Co-Intelligence Institute. And they're going to give us a kind of they'll give an immediate response to what they've heard. We'll have a little bit of discussion based on any questions that you've thrown into the chat. And then we're going to break out we'll have a bit of a break. And then in the second hour, we'll go into breakout groups to think about, okay, from what we've learned, what can we take forward in terms of climate assembly design and development? And also what kind of other work could Knoca do to support our work in this area? So quite a familiar format for many of us, but I hope this is going to be a really interesting and insightful workshop, at least trying to take some of our looking at how we might take some of our practice forward. So first of all, then, I'd like to welcome Tim Dorr, who's Associate Professor and Principal Researcher, Sarah Cornell, who's Associate Professor and Principal Researcher, and David Collste, who's just a researcher. I'm sorry about that, David, at the Stockholm Resilience Centre. And they're going to take us through some of their thinking in terms of how to integrate systems modelling into assemblies. Tim, I believe that you're going to start us off. Are you going to share a screen? No, we can't hear you.
Jump in briefly.
Yes, please do, while Tim's trying to sort his sound out.
Okay. If Tim were able to be heard and joining in, one of the things he for sure would be saying is he's a sustainability scientist. And the reason he's enthusiastic about being part of this meeting today is that he is the hands behind the Swedish MOOC, the Climate Assembly. David, can you be heard?
I think so. Do you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Yes.
I doing the sound checking at least.
Oh,
Yeah.
I think we can hear Tim now.
Good.
Okay, cool. Good. Yeah. So I'm a sustainability scientist and economist. I'm working on the system thinking and the development of system models and their use at the Resilience Centre. Over to Tim now.
Well, Sarah's already introduced me.
Right.
And my recent engagement with this is I've been coordinating putting together the Swedish Assembly.
And I'm a global environmental change scientist, and I'm also involved very often working with modelers. But my kind of big research challenge is how do we get top-down global change science to the level of action by normal people, but also kind of involving the policy process. So we can click down one slide. Yeah, excellent. We obviously need to acknowledge gratefully our funders, and we actually come from a couple of different projects. The Fair Trans project is a Swedish national project. It's organising the Climate Assembly in Sweden. The World Trans project that David and I work in. Okay, we all kind of work in Fair Trans. David and I also work in World Trans, which is an EU-funded project. Which, as it says, is looking to really improve the transparency of global systems models that affect people's decision-making that affect real people. And then Tim is the PI, and David and I are sort of also involved in a newly funded project, SISCA, that is researching exactly today's question, systems thinking in climate assemblies. So if you click the next, that's how we all hang together. The first question that we kind of need to tackle as we start today's discussion is, why do we even need to think about systems thinking in climate assemblies? I mean, what happens when you bring a whole load of citizens together? Why do we need to impose any kind of thinking on an assembly process? And many of us came to this topic partly, there's something special, I would say, about climate, which is climate change knowledge is fundamentally derived from climate systems models, which are intricate, they're opaque, and they already kind of capture we need a kind of a model literacy to even be able to understand how the climate change dilemmas we face have been diagnosed. When we talk about the goals for climate action, we need to point out to some extent that those are underpinned with information generated at completely other kinds of models. So we've got models talking to models, giving information to society, and very often there's a little shift in this analysis from the kind of pure science, let's say, to science that starts to build in different norms, assumptions, and presumptions about the way society works. Then when we get to the levels of action, climate action necessarily involves intervention in multiple systems, social and ecological or biophysical systems. And more we hear calls for climate action that are expressed in terms of systemic change, fundamental transformations to the ways that society works. So our starting point is very much that if we're talking about climate action, we need to be systems literate and model literate at the same time. Tim, handing over to you.
Okay, thanks. So, yeah, and of course, there's lots of different meanings of the word model, and it doesn't necessarily only mean a very complicated piece of computer code that is simulating something. So it also, in terms of systems thinking, we're also thinking about sort of mental models. But so here are why would we want to have systems thinking within a climate assembly? Well, first, to reflect on how things are connected, because those imply hard choices and conflicts that need to be deliberated over. So, for example, electric cars are one way to address reducing emissions, but of course they are connected through the demand for lithium and other rare metals to mining and resource conflicts or resource chains and sort of conflicts over resources. So systems thinking is necessary to perceive these connections. Systems thinking, another aspect of systems thinking is understanding how change actually happens. In terms of how, for example, you could have time lags or the relationship between stocks and flows. So this is a useful figure that helps a mental model of understanding that that emissions are a flow. So that's the gases that are being emitted, and the what's in the stock, what's in the bathtub here is the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And that's what matters for climate change. And it's been shown in various experiments that even MIT scientists don't always think about this in a very clear way. There's some very clear sort of heuristical mistakes that we can make where we think, for example, just reducing emissions means we're going to reduce climate change. And of course, reducing emissions here is just turning the tap down, but the bath could still be filling up. So the understanding a little bit about how that system behavior is actually having a bit of literacy about that can have real implications for how you make normative judgments about carbon budgets or how quickly emissions might decline. And the other thing is feedbacks I've got written here. So again, model thinking can help us to think about reinforcing feedbacks, which could be vicious or virtuous cycles. So here there's a balancing feedback where the more car journeys there is, the more congestion, and the congestion dissuades people from using their car. So that would be a balancing feedback, a sort of self-regulating system. But you could also think that congestion increases support for building new roads. And when you build new roads, then it becomes more convenient to use your car. So you can also have these sort of reinforcing feedbacks, vicious or virtuous cycles, which is all part of how change happens, which can be important for thinking about what we might do in response to climate change. But then also we've got this question of what's relevant. So when you start thinking about a system, you have to put some kind of boundary around it. And any conversation, whether or not you're thinking about systems thinking, people are having a certain things that are included and certain things that are excluded. And so explicitly thinking about systems thinking can make you think more about what's in and what's out. So for example, you might look at the actual events, but this is one thinking tool called the iceberg model. So you might see a particular event like catching a cold, and through thinking about that's what we see at the tip of the iceberg. But by thinking deeper, you actually think, okay, what's underlying that? And that kind of thinking can take you from what's visible to thinking to these indirect drivers and structural barriers to change. And this is just an example I pulled out from the North Tyneside Climate Assembly in 2021, where this was so this is not about using computer models. This is about a structured exercise for the citizens in a climate assembly to start with a point and thinking what's underlying that. Climate change is an emergency, and you can see that the citizens have discussed what's in the boundary, what's relevant there. You've got things like consumerism or being obsessed with buying latest products, or the lifestyle that we have, or social media. So the citizens themselves are doing a kind of expanding the boundaries of their model through this kind of exercise. And that leads to the question of the normative decisions that are made whenever you're creating a model and you're choosing what's in or out of your particular model system. And depending on what you value, that feeds back into what you think is relevant to include within your model. David.
Yeah, and from a more theoretical standpoint, there is a triangulation between what systems and how you draw boundaries of a system, depending on valuations of facts and values. And this is a quote from Ulrich: "The facts we observe and the way we evaluate them depend on how we bound the system of concern. Different value judgments can make us change boundary judgments, which in turn makes the facts look different. Knowledge of new facts can equally make us change boundary judgments, which in turn makes previous evaluation look different, etc." So it basically states that not only of the observations of facts is necessary to think about where we set the boundaries. So in this sense, what is discussed, for example, what's included in a climate assembly and what is not included, but also values. And learning new facts and making new observations can actually change what you include in the boundary, basically what is discussed and what topics are dealt with. Next, please. And this is a tool also from a more systems modeling perspective that is used, where you choose what is endogenous and what's exogenous. So what is from within the system and what's exogenous, affecting it from the outside, and what do you choose to exclude? So all these are system boundaries tools or tools of boundary critique, where you discuss what to include in a specific discussion, and what is part of your system, so to say. And it's also a way to kind of look at the system from outside and look at your mental models from the outside. And in October, we had a workshop where we went through quite a few different tools. I know some of the participants here were part. We have Andreas, for example, Nikolaidis Lindqvist, who is a colleague in World Trans, who's also a Climate Interactive ambassador. So this is one, Climate Interactive has this tool, which is an online model that you can use with stakeholders and has been used in the Climate Assembly in the US, for example. So if you, for example, click on carbon price in the lower left, next please, and you increase the carbon price, you see a change here directly in the model system. This is available online. We will share a link to this. But then you can also go, so, oh, great, we reduced the emissions a lot. We reduced the temperature. But then if you'll go and look at the carbon price, for example, you can do this in the drop-down menu. You will see this. And then you may ask, is this a feasible policy option in a climate assembly that everyone can agree on with the effect of this high cost of energy, for example? So that's one tool that we explored. Next, please. You're muted.
Thank you. The other tool that we considered and we think we will certainly use is so this is not a computer-based model. This is a card game called Climate Fresque, which was developed in France and which is exponentially spreading through an interesting model of you participate in it for 3 hours and you can become a facilitator, and then more and more people taking part in it. And what appeals to us with this is it's a way to try and understand the basic science produced by IPCC and to understand the representation of what affects what. And it basically works that there are 42 or 39 of these cards, and on the back of each card is a little snippet of information from IPCC that explains the card and its role. And your job you work as a team with a facilitator, but a rather hands-off facilitation, to understand, discuss what the meaning is, and arrange the cards to build up a understanding of how, through these 39 cards, the basic cause and effect relationships, which are expressed in the IPCC science reports. So for us, it's appealing as a way that we can do the ABC of climate, but in an interactive way, in a way that's perhaps not threatening for people who are skeptical towards the science, in a way that people are owning the process themselves. Everybody is empowered to read a snippet of information on the card that they receive, and then you work together to fit it together. So it's a kind of clever pedagogical tool to understand the basics of climate in an interactive way. And it is also helps to give this sort of systems perspective of seeing how these different things are linked together. Having said that, the boundaries of this system are very set. So it includes human activities, their impact on the climate system, and the impact of climate change on various human activities, but it doesn't really go into any of the reason why emissions are going up or different possible mitigation scenarios. So we're planning to use this as a kind of snapshot of the IPCC science, which we don't really want to get into a lot of deliberation and questioning over. But then the question is, okay, if we expand the boundary of what we have on the table here with this Climate Fresque exercise, then like the exercise that I showed before with the tree roots, then the citizens can start to, the members of the Assembly can start to expand out beyond what's on the table and has been studied by IPCC science into what does it mean for their nation or their community, or what kind of things need to be changed to change the scenario. Okay.
Yes, and a lot of systems modelers have moved into doing more interactive games of the type that Tim presented, but also there is a list of 22 games in the Climate Change Playbook, which is based on a system thinking playbook that was released some years ago. And I would like to do one of the exercises from here. So I would ask everyone, including Sarah and Tim, to take your finger and hold it above your head and look at it from below and start to rotating it clockwise. And slowly move it downwards. And then you look at it from above Is it still moving clockwise? No, right? So for most people, seems like the finger started to move counterclockwise, but it's just because we're changing perspectives. So this is one of the exercises in the book that is wants to pinpoint the importance of the perspectives that you choose, the values and the judgments with regards to what facts you considered, etc. So this is just a simple game that is typically done in this kind of settings, and then you have a connected discussion about climate change and a debrief of what did we learn from this game. It's just one very small exercise that you can do. There's 21 more in this book that I wanted to mention. Next, please. In the October workshop, we also had Etienne Rouet, who I think in the call today. He is an expert in participatory modeling and group model building. These pictures are from an exercise that I have been part of, a project I've been part of, that was done during COVID, as you see, where different stakeholders were putting together a model with causal loop diagrams. Basically, you're trying to link, as was done in the climate fresk that Tim was showing, but more also including different societal pieces. And you start to link what is linked to what, and how do we understand these links. And then you start to develop a systems map basically together with the stakeholders. So this is also an activity that we have been considering with regards to a climate assembly.
Okay, so now we're getting to the really juicy stuff. We have explored several techniques in the process of establishing the Swedish Climate Assembly. The ones we're definitely weaving into the assembly process are the top three. One is a sort of an interactive visualization of a kind of climate model. It's an analysis of the resource implications of different real-world policies. Listing, I mean, it's been used for different cities and for different countries. Its manifestation here in Sweden is a tool called Panorama, and you'll be able to see these links at some point. The real power of Panorama for us is that like I say, it gives a visualization. It shows which sectors of the national economy need the biggest amount of transformation, if we count it as a thing you can add up as quantity. But also it lets people see the implications of different policies and policy mixes in actually making change in the context of the Paris Agreement by 2045, which is Sweden's national commitment. So it's a tool with modeling behind it, but the interface that our citizens will be able to interact with is just the visualization of the output of this kind of resource allocation tool. We've mentioned Climate Fresk already. We're very much planning to use it. And again, we don't have a picture of the frescoes that come out from Climate Fresk, but the reason we really want to bring it in is that it really supports this shared learning. It's very much a kind of a process that encourages an emergent understanding, a collective understanding of the cause-effect relationships in climate change. Every fresco that is made is going to be different from every previous one, but it isn't just the object and the kind of almost like the collective artwork, but also the dialogues and the conversations that start to do what David was flagging with the Ulrich triangle, changing the way people define their own boundary understandings of the climate problem. And just to pick up on Stuart Worsley's comments in the chat, yes, that is an entirely unpredictable and emergent process. So we're entering it really needing to emphasize that we ourselves are learning about the social system that responds to the climate change system. And then, as David has already said, there's a really rich resource in the climate change playbook with techniques and interactive activities that help people to understand system behavior in a very embodied way, but also in a way that supports dialogue, that supports a kind of careful, deliberative, shared understanding. And there's an awful lot of understandings too about how that knowledge can play out as action. There are, and we have also taken into account the possibility of using group model building, but one of the, I mean, there's 1,000 reasons why we can't fit that into this particular assembly, and that will be something that we can probably discuss in more depth in the little breakout rooms. Part of the assembly is also, sorry, the Swedish Climate Assembly is about sustainable climate action. So we've got various tools that help us understand the implications of climate action on other internationally agreed sustainable development goals. We've considered those and decided that it's very difficult to entrain that into the process, partly because they're not systems-y enough. And then we have, you know, like I indicated right at the beginning, there are many modeling tools, many systems models, and many combined and integrated system tools that we can bring in. And again, this, for us, we have a series of sort of balancing acts. So where have we landed with the Swedish Climate Assembly? It hasn't happened yet. We can't share you our outcomes, but we can share this experience of trying to do this balancing act of the aims of a good citizens' assembly with a good communication or engagement with questions of climate science and climate policy. Our principles, if you like, we're very much committed to learning together rather than the phrase that gets used in our circles is experts on tap, not on top. At the same time, we're committed to providing the best available information in a context where knowledge is contested. We're also aware that climate and climate action are deeply polarizing issues. And then we've also got to throw in the other balancing act, people's various understandings of democratic societies and, of course, democratic ideals in the process of a citizens' assembly itself. So just to summarize this slide, we've focused on nationally relevant resources. We've focused on resources that support dialogue. And we're focusing a little bit on processes that recognize that the assembled mini public is itself a system. And I think my last one is, we're trying very hard to persuade everybody involved that we're there to listen and learn, not just to talk and transmit. And that's a very challenging thing when the messages from science about climate are actually very urgent and are demanding action. So Graham has said, throw in questions. I'm definitely going to be echoing exactly that. Is there anything else that we need to say?
I think maybe just to pick up on that in terms of the discussions of the use of these tools, there's a real kind of discussion about the way in which something as fixed and structured as a model can be a tool for helping learning and can empower participants to have a better understanding, but also could be something that's oppressive in terms of if it's seen as very fixed and scientific and frame setting. So I think that's why we put a lot of emphasis on this boundary critique, this sort of model literacy, which is that, yeah, you can show me a model and it'll show me the output, but then I'm going to ask you, okay, what's included in the model and what's excluded in the model? And we can have a discussion about that, the boundary of that model. And that's the same for every model, you know, the biggest, fanciest models that the IPCC uses. And so the trick is to fit in an engagement with some of these tools, but whilst sort of giving the members a capacity to question in what's included and not included in the model and interpret the results in the light of that.
Is there one more slide, Tim?
Oh, there might be, sorry. Okay, some references.
Of course, like good academics. We really would welcome people to share any wonderful relevant literature as well. I can't emphasize this enough. We're happy to be here because we want your thoughts, not just to transmit ours.
Thank you so much. That was really helpful and insightful. I'm going to push you out of the call for a sec, not out of the call, but out of the spotlight just for a second. And when I bring in Claire, who's going to give some immediate reactions. As I said, Claire is the was one of the initiators, a co-initiator of the Global Assembly, and is the knowledge and practice lead at ISWE, and has been herself wrestling for a long time with these questions about climate change. Climate change, of course, everyone has, about systems change and systems thinking. So Claire, your thoughts on what you've heard, if we can bring you into the space.
Yes, thank you very much. And I just want to say that I'm bringing these reflections with as much humility as I can, because I think this work is challenging, and this is very much reflections that are informed by my work as a deliberative democracy practitioner from Europe. And I've experienced challenges of trying to bring systemic practice into the design and delivery of the 2021 Global Assembly. So I think acknowledging my positionality and worldviews from the outset is quite important in order to frame my contribution. So briefly, I just want to talk about the current concern that I'm noticing in the deliberative democracy field at the moment, which is raising the issue that can deliberative democracy theory and practice and the intervention such as citizens' assembly address systemic thinking? And they try to address parts of the system, often these processes, or isolated dynamic, without a sufficient grasp of the broader whole. So what the Swedish Climate Assembly, from my perspective, is trying to do is to bring system thinking and modeling into the design of the assembly. And as Tim said in your presentation, you said we are putting boundaries to what's in it, what's in, what's out. And this is where, for me, the potential of these models, but also their limits, are being surfaced. So there are various tools of systemic design, and they offer a way for deliberative processes to be crafted and run so that they are more attentive to complex interacting dynamics. And there's a range of toolkits and methods, so that's what this is really rich, what you've presented. But to what extent do they highlight and enable systemic transformation or contribute to exploring dominant worldviews? And this is where I think the iceberg model is really helpful, because they're looking at the mental models, the paradigms, the cultural narratives, the worldviews that underline deliberative democracy itself to some extent. And so what I'd like to do now is just bring a recent publication from the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance that has just published a piece which is entitled "Can Deliberative Democracy Be Decolonized?" And that's a challenging question, I think, for us deliberative democracy practitioners from the global north. And this is not a comfortable place, and I have to be completely honest, I've wrestled with it working on the Global Assembly, a global project which has tried to bring system thinking into the design and delivery of the Global Assembly. And just to give you one example that I think illustrates the challenges, and I'll finish on that. When we designed the Global Assembly, we had a Global Assembly Knowledge and Wisdom Committee, which was an advisory committee, which was formed to provide input on the framing question that the Assembly deliberated on, the selection of experts and witnesses, and on the content and design of the information materials. But while the composition of the committee demonstrated some level of diversity in terms of worldviews and origin and expertise, so for instance, there were 2 Indigenous knowledge wisdom keepers as part of the Knowledge and Wisdom Committee. We had experts in system change, transformative economics, and critics of capitalism. The evaluation of the Global Assembly showed that the committee was still relatively homogeneous in terms of discourses, and which mostly spoke to ecological modernization. So the missing discourses in the Assembly members' deliberation to some extent mirror the missing discourses in the committee, which, for instance, didn't really include radical critiques of capitalism and the current political economy. So despite attempting to bring systems thinking into the Global Assembly, the evaluation showed that in practice, the process had limitations. and in terms of deliberation and outcomes. So for me, this raises lots of questions about how we design and govern these processes and what outcome they produce when we bring system perspective.
Thank you so much, Claire. That was really, really, really clear and a challenging question for the organisers. For the organisers of the Leaders Assembly, I'll be interested to hear how they respond. Next, I'd like to invite Martin Rausch to give a short input. As I said, Martin's is an international trainer and co-creator of participation projects and an associate of the Co-Intelligence Institute. And I think you had some involvement with the Austrian Climate Assembly. Is that right, Martin?
Yes, I was. Yes,
okay.
I was part of it.
So over to you. Just give us your thoughts on what you've heard or how this fits in your way of thinking.
I think I just love the thinking in the direction of how you're using the games or the tree or the iceberg model or the participatory modeling. In general, I just think that approach is much more better, much more efficient in the sense that it's very interactive. I just love that. And I think there's maybe a tension between having the system open or closed, in the sense how open is it in the direction the whole facilitation goes? How do we keep it in a certain arena, and how open do we go? And that's a matter of the whole problem of deliberation. Do we give options to choose from, or do we use facilitation like dynamic facilitation, where the questions could be changed, for example, for something like that. So that's a huge one big issue in it. Besides the whole system, the games and the participatory modeling and that, the question is for me, how do we, in the whole design process, how well is system thinking and system dynamics involved in it? Is it iterative, for example? Is it multi-scale? Can they go home and play the games at home in their community, meet the mayor, and so they learn to do it themselves. So that's a whole systems thinking they carry on for themselves. I think that whole process, not just using them, but teaching them, making them, empowering them to use it, using them in the communities. And I think that's also in the Global Assembly with Claire and Rich, a very important thing, that they do it at home, and then they do mini publics at home or so in their home communities and so forth, or meet different institutions, or it could even be the football club, so I think that's a very important part. So I can only, and the thing is with using like the climate fresque, I think it's always really important to think about in which context am I in regard to that? Am I in a city? And of course you're going to do that, but I think that's that whole, to get to see the participants as experts. So they're experts of their reality. And I think that's going to be very important to highlight. And I like that partnership culture you're trying to establish. But that, I think, in the whole design has to be really communicated, because you guys are so smart. The way you present it, it's perfect. And it's going to be difficult that the participants feel, oh, we're experts as well. So I think you're going to have to establish that and try to. So that's, I just love what you're doing, and I think move forward with that. So yeah, I think I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Martin. Do you want to bring our three presenters back in the space? Tim and Martin as well. Tim and David as well. You put your hand up to speak, have you, Tim?
Yeah.
And David and Claire as well. That's fantastic. So did you want to, does one of you want to respond to what you've heard from Claire and David at all? Who would like to take us?
I wanted to just start very quickly with the last point. We always focus on the last piece of thing we heard, but Martin, your last point about just to feedback that yeah, we have been agonizing over this with Fresk because it is, I mean, there is this codified IPCC knowledge which people need to understand, but of course it could be actually yeah, countering against this sense of I'm experts of my own reality, because this is talking about something which is outside my experience. So in discussion with our facilitators, DigiDem Lab, who've run been involved in running deliberative mini, I mean, they've really pushed for it to come later. We initially thought it should be early in the process because it's getting the ground common scientific knowledge about climate change over, but for exactly the reason that you said, they've really advised us that no, first people need to meet in the small groups. They need to understand their personal relationships to the issue and have that feeling of being experts and having that competency and confidence before they're then subjected to, even though they're doing it in a very friendly way and that everyone's empowered to read their own card, it's still scientific, globalized scientific knowledge that they're reading in the cards rather than their own experience. So that really rang true what you said, and we hope that we'll be able to manage that. But it is I want to acknowledge as well that it is a concern whenever you're using any of these. I mean, some of the processes are completely open-ended, encouraging people to build their own model. Others of them are bringing an externally put together model, and I think that it's not. I think that's not necessarily a bad thing, because even our understanding of climate change, the Paris Agreement, is all underpinned, as Sarah said, by models. There's modeling thinking going. So we're all being governed by models, even if we don't realize it when we're talking about climate change. So I think to a certain extent, trying to increase the capacity to understand that is important. And my last thought is that in the Climate Assembly in Sweden, when we have an objective, the Climate Assembly is aiming to enhance the public and political debate around climate in Sweden. So it's a communication exercise. It's not a scientific experiment. And it's not bound within a scientific modeling project. But I think there could be interesting things. So there's a limit to how much we can get into, but there could be interesting collaborations using deliberative mini publics to collaborate with scientists working on these big models, to make them more transparent, to empower a group of citizens to really focus in on what's going in and out of this model and critique the model. And there's been a few good examples. There was one from Germany where there was a hardcore scientific modeling project, and that a deliberative mini project that sort of asked them difficult questions and really influenced what was included in the model or not. That could be another thing for the future.
Thanks, Tim. Sarah and David, did you have anything to add? Did you have anything to respond to Claire's concern about the way that models might potentially sort of mean certain discourses aren't present, or, you know, or are they a way of enabling discourses to become more present? And so I'm just kind of interested in your thoughts on that.
I see that as one of the real predicaments of working in a complex social system. And, you know, I think that we are having very active conversations now about, I mean, on one hand, working with the process of compiling the Citizen Assembly itself, where I would say many of us involved in that process are actively bringing insights from these contemporary, and actually not contemporary, they go back hundreds of years, but there seems to be a very strong contemporary focus on decolonial dialogue, let's call it that. So we, you know, the discussions about what are the criteria for sortition, selection, what counts as representation, is quantitative representation enough, or do we somehow need to have a focus on shared meanings and histories and experiences? Those are really active conversations, and you know, unfortunately, for a process that to some extent must be designed by algorithm, there is no algorithm for dealing with these really profound ethical, cultural, and historic dilemmas. And so with that said, I think that that's another one of the kind of the principles that we want to bring in. We know that we'll have people from across the political spectrum, partly because that's by design in the Assembly. We know that we'll have people representing as much as possible in our kind of Swedish representative algorithm, different experiences of being incomers or people with very long-standing historic links to the nation. So, I mean, that's also part of the reason that finding that the design of the process itself needs to create oh my goodness, I'm already getting normative here. We're working to make a space that can be as honest and trustworthy as we would want in a democratic mini public. You know, kind of we need people to be able to be comfortable to share their experiences, their histories, their views, because the whole point of the Citizens' Assembly is that it helps to enrich the public debate at a time when very often that debate is blocked or sort of, I have to do hand gestures here, sorry, you know, kind of the debate is being blocked because these things can't be articulated. Now, it's not necessarily the case that articulating them will make the debate work better. We shouldn't assume that we can design the perfect system that will give us the perfect dialogue that will lead to glorious climate action. But, you know, very much we know that not doing that is a known obstacle to the kinds of social change that we need. So, you know, kind of, it sounds so grudging, doesn't it? Anyway.
It sounds unambitious, but it isn't. Yes. David, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I really like this focus of I think your Claire and others working paper where you focus on systems change. I think bringing in climate fresk is a way, as we talked about, to explain kind of the basic or discuss the basic understanding of what's going on in the climate system. But then I think that should really need to be followed up by a discussion of what is included in the system and what is not. Especially in that case, there is a lack of the social aspects. So the iceberg model and other ways of kind of engaging with the system boundaries are here very important, I think. In the best case, learning, like improving your systems literacy, also means that you start to can see how systems can change, right? So both understanding complexity and how complicated systems work, you also can start to engage how could system work instead. In the critical systems heuristics tradition with Ulrich, he asked the question like, what is the system and what ought to be the system? So then you're, by choosing what to include in your boundaries, you also start to see what you choose not to include as issues of concerns, etc.
I mean, a very simple way of thinking about this is how many climate assemblies decide to break into themes, and so it's kind of like transport, food, and you're already in a sense saying your boundary is this, you know, and I know we've seen that in a lot of assemblies where it's actually hard to start making connections between them because you've been put into a particular, you've been classified in a particular way. And I think that's a kind of really interesting sort of boundary problem that we have in a lot of assembly structure without us necessarily at the time having thought that was the implication of what we were doing. We were already dividing the system in a particular way, and saying what was in and what was out. And we've done a review of or there've been a couple of reviews now of assembly outputs, and almost none of them have got anything to say about energy systems or about finance. And that's because neither of those things were ever one of the thematics that people were asked to look at. So it's really interesting how we're already doing, even if we feel that we're not necessarily, this isn't speaking to us, we're actually doing this already through some sort of design. Just a quick question, I guess picking up on a couple of things that came in the chat. One was a comment about, and I think you've sort of answered this, I think it was partly part of Sarah's answer as well, is that how important diversity is in this, you know, the fact about what a climate assembly looks like and is even with the caveats that were raised by Claire, that the group that you're going to be working with is incredibly diverse compared to who you're used to working with in your kind of modeling activities. And there was a question that was raised by Sana is, do you think actually this kind of modeling, this thinking and using these kind of modeling techniques might help in relation to dealing with kind of polarization, dealing with people who have different views about the nature of the climate crisis? Or do you think it actually just might itself cause problems? So I'm kind of interested on that. And the other was, I was very interested that you decided, for example, you're not going to use any of the simulators. You're not going to use that kind of thing. And you're not, and what I'm also interested in how you relate to sort of some of the work that's been done with Assemblies of sort of creating different scenarios, and how you see sort of scenarios fitting with modeling. So I'm just kind of interested, there's a couple of very different things there, one on diversity in the room, and the other about these kind of the other ways that people are thinking about it in relations to sort of scenario thinking, and how does that work in your world?
I think we didn't have time to mention it here, but we had scenario thinking. We were quite inspired by the Scottish Assembly's use of scenarios. So it's really just a case of resources and time and scope. The Swedish Assembly isn't massively well resourced, and compared to some other big assemblies. So we really had to sort of focus our efforts a little bit. And then you said, could modeling, participatory modeling address disagreement or polarization, or could it make it worse? I think both things are quite possible, but there is a tradition of participatory modeling with stakeholder representatives, because the idea of using mini publics and sortition for this is kind of new in sustainability sciences, but there's a long tradition of working with different stakeholders and using model building process as a sort of boundary object where we can come down and try and agree what we disagree about. And sometimes when you're actually using simulation models, sometimes it can be a big dispute. And so this is some of the early sort of participatory modeling work by Carl Waters and others. There might be a big dispute about whether something's important or not. So you put it in the model and you see that actually it doesn't, should that be there or shouldn't it be there? And maybe stay, and you might find that when you try and model the system, it doesn't matter that much. So kind of using an object that you're building together as a way to really tease out why do we disagree, and maybe move towards more of that meta consensus.
Sarah or David, do you have anything to add at all? No?
I think I haven't totally abandoned the idea that that the idea of scenarios would be introduced. I mean, not necessarily, again, that it would be imposed, but some way of actually equipping the participants, or encouraging them to capture, I mean, it's interesting, the word narrative has come up as well in the chat, to capture points of divergence. I think, again, another one of the balancing acts that we've had is a little bit that somehow you get people together and they will ultimately agree, they'll learn to play nice. And obviously, even if they do learn to play nice, that doesn't necessarily mean that we wouldn't want them to be able to capture and articulate and be able to present the points of real divergence, or or where there actually are equally good alternatives for society. There's the coexistence of options is actually a very rich resource that could be coming out here. So as academics, we might call it scenarios. There are 1,001 other ways that kind of diversity or pluralism can be held and carried forward. Back to the other comments in the chat about the temporality of this process, and actually also linking into sort of Martin's earlier comment about the ripple effects. There will be ripple effects. We don't know what they are, but it would be very nice if people, just the same as the fresque gives an object, a kind of a shared object that people can hold and touch and refer to, and they can say, oh, remember that yellow arrow, and everybody will remember the yellow arrow. It can be really helpful if there's some kind of scenario thing, shared object, that they can carry out with them. And I
Yeah.
think, you know, we're at the moment quite open to what that could be. Again, the idea that, you know, experts, witnesses, people with relevant experience are on tap, not on top.
Yeah. David, did you have anything before I ask Alex and Claire whether before I ask Martin and Claire for last thoughts before we move? You're okay, are you?
Yeah, please ask me.
I was gonna offer Martin and Claire the right of response or the right of adding of throwing something else in just before we take a break. Martin?
I just have something very simple. I'm not sure how it's organized. I think there are different weekends, right? So they will have a setting where they stay in a hotel together overnight, right? Is that right? I don't know.
Some of them, they'll have dinner together, but not the ones who live in Stockholm,
I
unfortunately.
just want to say how important it is for people to be able to drink a beer together with the scientists, or have these evening sessions where you have small groups where the people who are skeptical can talk to the scientists or eat with the scientists and ask them and meet them as human beings. This aspect is underestimated, I believe, because that's where a lot happens, and beer helps. And I just want to, and I think we have to be very aware of this, because these personal interactions, because I always have this abstract, oh, that's Professor so-and-so, but when I meet him, he has kids, he has the same problems as I do, and he asks me questions, not only one around. So there's a lot about that I want to emphasize as a part of the systemic situation. That's a very simple intervention, but it does a lot, I believe. I just want to stop with that.
I think the one of the challenges of moving assemblies online, and I think Claire's had this experience as well, is it's actually, you know, you lose some of this, you lose some of those moments that are very rich. And obviously, if you're doing a global assembly, that makes it particularly difficult. Claire, do you want to throw in any thoughts, not about beer necessarily, other alcoholic and non-alcoholic beverages?
Well, funny enough, with the Global Assembly, despite it being online, the assembly members sometimes initiated within their own community some gathering, and they shared on the final session. They came together and shared some food, and we had amazing, it's public actually, the final session, it's recorded. And so I agree, that's conducive to connection. I just want to say that for me, as a practitioner, it's been, so it's a journey. And I think having a reflective practice as a practitioner or an academic, as you go through this process and writing down when you see the challenges as they emerge and how you respond to them as involved in this process, that's really helpful to go back to it. And I remember moments personally, for instance, with the Global Assembly, when I could see how the system change challenge were brought up and how people responded to them or not, and we can learn a lot from that. And that brings a question for me around the evaluation of your assembly. And I know there's an external evaluation, but I'm really interested in potentially having reflective, iterative, formative, some people call it, evaluation rather than summative at the end, because that helps as practitioners ourselves to reflect on our own biases and worldviews as the process unfolds.
That's fantastic. Listen, we're going to now give you an opportunity to engage in this discussion. So we're going to take a short break until 10 past. It's been I think it's been a really interesting learning experience already. I've personally learned a lot, but we're going to have a break. It's good Zoom hygiene to take a little bit of time away from the computer. We're going to then break into breakout groups, think about what the challenges and opportunities of using systems modeling or integrating systems modeling might be within assemblies, based on what we've heard and based on your own experiences. And then we'll come back at the end of that and sort of learn what we each other have heard, and also think a little bit about how Knoca can take forward a bit more work in this area. I'd really like to thank Tim, Sarah, David, Claire and Martin for their really articulate and insights and for the thoughts they've already raised. I think we're going to have a really interesting discussion and collective and collaborative thinking over the next in the second hour. I'd like to invite people to come and join me group by group. In group one, which was Celinda and Tim. Celinda, are you doing it, or is someone from it? Did you manage to get someone else from your group to do it?
We didn't even get to that question, so I think I'm doing it.
Okay.
Unless, Tim, you want to do it?
No, it's good for you to do it because Tim's going to come back in a second.
He's going to come
back out again.
We didn't get very far on your questions, Graham.
Okay.
So we did an introduction, and I realized I was the least knowledgeable in our little group. Everyone was so experienced, which was good for me. So I learned a lot. We have people who are working with consultancy firms on climate assemblies, working on global assemblies, citizen assemblies across Europe.
What were the kind of key learnings, or do you want me to drag Tim in to say what the key learnings were? It's up to you.
Well, I can just give you my reflections as new to this citizen assemblies. In a way, I've only been in part of the project for a few months. We have one comment that the system modelers do not listen to the feedback from the citizen assemblies, and that the modelers are very much focused on the quantitative aspects, whereas almost everyone in our group touched upon ethical aspects or aspects of ethics. And the more normative questions that are deliberated in the citizen assembly. So that's creates, I think that is, I'm not a good listener, writer, and taking notes at the same time.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Tim,
I'll add my comments in our document.
Tim, did you want to throw anything else in that you thought was interesting that came out?
Quite a few interesting things, but maybe one was the this trying to connect between people's everyday experience and a sort of external academic type knowledge, and the need not to connect with people where they are, build up from their shared expectations, shared desires, and building up from there. So the dialogue is going up that way through sort of images and pictures rather than top down.
That makes sense. Thanks for both of you. Thank you. Morten, did you want to kind of feedback about what went on in our route?
Yes, I can say a few words. So about the challenges of integrating systems modeling into climate assemblies, we talked about that as with any other things in climate assemblies, time and resources is important, and then it can also varies between cultures. And when systems thinking involves big numbers, IPCC scenarios, carbon budgets, especially tipping points we talked about, and the many assumptions behind that, it's important to be aware of the different understandings that people have when they come to the assemblies. Fortunately, there was also some opportunities mentioned, and especially when you succeed with having simple modeling, you can engage with the rich conversations, and these kind of toys and simple tools that a lot of links have been shared in the chat are examples of that. And then as well, systems thinking can be used as kind of deactivating the cause effect understanding of policies. So usually people can come to think about that something either work or not, and actually thinking through this systems approach can help people to understand there are different outcomes of different policies, and understanding them in a ways of experimentation and learning is very useful and beneficial for people to understand why something is not working, and have a dialogue on how the different policies can work both integrated together and why they're not working. Yeah.
Fantastic. That was an excellent summary of what we just discussed. Absolutely brilliant. One thing that I thought was interesting was another thing which you didn't mention because it was a slightly off topic, was Mayo was making the point about how as a designer we really ought to be involved in systems thinking, particularly in relation to the system of policy that we may be trying to affect, or the system of public debate on what are our ways of affecting that system, and it's not always obvious. And I think that was a really interesting insight. I mean, it's a different type of systems thinking, but and I guess sometimes when we've run assemblies, people haven't engaged in that systems thinking and have this sort of magical thinking of, if we just produce some recommendations, they'll be picked up. And actually doing some of that work would be really important. So I thought that was a really interesting thought as well. Thank you for your contribution. If I could get group 3, which was Lena.
That's me, yes.
Lena.
So I'm going to try to stick to the systems points that were made, but we crossed a lot of bridges in that discussion. A lot of different themes were tackled, so I'm going to try to keep it sucked in. On designing the assembly, we talked about the importance of, while having systems thinking in mind, the question of having a question or a script that seems important to all, but at the same time that is relevant to all participants, but at the same time the point is also to get many perspectives. So there is a tension here already between having common important points and at the same time a diversity of lived experiences. And obviously, the aim of having then systems thinking integrated in question, it becomes a layer of complexity added onto it, or at least a complication. One experience I was brought by someone in the breakout room was distributing a card game to some participants ahead of the assembly to play with their friends, their family, or anything like that, just a deck of cards, which supports basically a personal reflection on what is my personal link to this issue, what is my lived experiences. So you kind of bridge the tension between this question that makes it relevant to all, even though you have different aspects and perspective to it. So that was very interesting. And then as you go into the assembly itself, there is another tension that kind of comes as an obstacle to the systems thinking, and that's the kind of automatic compartmentalization. So splitting into groups and tackling transportation and such, and that's what we talked about here. But with that comes the immediate assumption of speaking responsibility as well, because that's how academia is organized. You get disciplines, each tasks with researching their own topic. That's how government is organized as well, each task. And that's also something that needs to be, that's a rough wording, but I don't have a best one, but destroying this assumption as well and going beyond it to also embrace responsibility for the whole of the system and not just tackling it in silo. So yeah, but basically one option that was brought up as maybe a solution to that was actively bringing in, when grouping, which can be necessary, breakout rooms and such to engage in discussion, actively bringing people of different ways of life and organizations and disciplines and such to ensure that naturally different perspectives are brought up, which can enlarge the scope of the answer to the question. Would anyone like any important points to that? Have I forgotten anything? Maybe David, as you
sounds like you covered a lot already, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. Well done, Lena. I have nothing to add there.
I think one of the interesting questions, and I really take the point, because I raised it, that there's a tendency with big climate assemblies to break into these policy silos in a sense. The challenge is to think, how do you organize it so you don't do that, but you get through the work? And I think that's the really interesting question that we kind of there's a sort of path dependency. We've done this, this is the way we've been organizing it. And the couple of assemblies that have tried to do it differently, well, the Luxembourg just ran out of time. They just couldn't they had to actually add extra time on. So it's I think it's a great challenge. I think the question is how we do it is a really interesting one. But thank you both. So our last group then was led by Andreas. And are you feeding back, Andreas?
Sure, I can summarize. And it's cool to see that the different groups have touched on very similar topics, it seems. First of all, I found it really exciting that in our group we had both people quite experienced in systems modeling and in climate assemblies or similar type of setups, and we focus a lot of our discussions on the challenges with how do you set the boundaries of the models and of the both mental or the simulation models that you use in these sessions, and the challenges and needs for setting boundaries. So we talked a lot about that. In many cases, having the boundaries, which is sort of connected to these more siloed type discussions is that it's sort of it helps you. It's practical, like it's a practical constraints to avoid talking about everything and anything, and really feel that you're moving forward. But at the same time, it does or it can limit sort of some of the options and solutions that you discuss or that you come through in these assemblies. I think one of the very concrete sort of good advices I got from, now I don't remember whom it was who gave it, was that a lot of that is in the planning, that to make sure that you have wide enough boundaries to facilitate a good discussion without trying to cover everything. In the preparation, you need to do your homework, you need to do your legwork, and maybe even do some survey or review of different perspectives and participants before the climate assembly. I thought that was very practical thing that could be applied, that you could do in beforehand. And we also talked about sort of where does the citizen assembly or the climate assembly sit in this sort of broader policy or ecosystem landscape. Like that's also how does it tie into decisions and policy making, both upwards and downwards in the broader system. And we also had one very important note about there needs to be good follow-up to the participants in these assemblies to keep them engaged and feel that it's not just a one-on event and then nothing happens, that a lot of the work also has to be done after the assembly. And I encourage anyone who was in my group to jump in if you think that Andreas missed a very important point, and I want to have it. I want to have it said.
No, there's a silence, so I think you did a good job, Andreas. That's really great. Can I just put in? Can I pull back in Tim and David and Sarah just while we're doing that? Someone raised this question about. Alex, I think, raised the issue about facilitation techniques in order that we stop working in silos. I think I'm just trying to find it now. Someone was talking about, I wish I could find the name now. Someone was talking about the way that they shared. Oh yes, Anya was saying that the working groups that were developing ideas in silos shared them with or got questions from the other people working in different areas. And I've seen that happen in Scotland. One group would start writing the recommendations and then pass it over to another group so that you would start to de-silo it, if you like. And I've also seen examples where assemblies have almost had roadshows where the people will sort of, they'll display the different things they're coming up with, and others will walk around and start making comments on them. But it is still really difficult about how you do that. I mean, I think I understand with the Swedish one that's going to be mostly focused on transportation, which will still have silos within it. But even then, that makes it slightly easier. I just wanted to say one other thing just quickly before I get final reflections. And it was something that Sarah said. We may have given the impression, and if we did, it isn't right, that the Swedish Assembly is just an academic project. It is not an academic project. It is actually an intervention into the Swedish debate about climate. It isn't related to government per se. It's trying to raise climate. It's trying to contribute to climate debate within the country. So I just wanted to say that because it was something Sarah said in our group, and it could be mistaken. Just because I've got 3 academics with me doesn't mean that the project is academic. So I just wanted to reinforce that. We would actually be less interested in it in Knoca if it was just an academic project. So anyway, Tim, Sarah, David, do you have any last thoughts, any comments on what you've heard, anything that has come up that's made you think again, or just glad to have spent some time in some space with some people who are interested in what you've had to say? So David, do you want to start? Have you got any thoughts on what's happened over the last couple of hours?
Wow, it's really difficult to summarize, I think. No. I really take away some positive comments about what we're doing, and that there seem to be interest, and I feel some encouragement here, which is really useful, because we're kind of groping a bit in the dark with how to move this ahead. So yeah, I hope we can be in touch with some of you again, and please reach out if you have concrete tips on how we should move forward.
Fantastic. Sarah?
I'm busy typing a quick response in chat to Morten.
It's not a long rant. You're not still going on about tipping points, are you?
I am. It's just a monologue now, though, so that's fine. I just want to also say an immense thank you to absolutely everybody for the sharing of experience. The chat alone is such a rich resource. And the generosity that people have of wanting to share their experience of assemblies at every level of the, models, however we choose to understand them. In the short break, Tim and I and David were standing in the corridor going, we are going to listen to this recording over and over again. It's really powerful and really useful. So we've achieved what I wanted, at least, which is to harvest everybody else's brains in this process.
So we were instrumentally useful for you, is what you're saying.
You were. And like everyone else has said, I hope you continue to be. We will also try to be useful to you.
Tim, was there anything you wanted to throw in?
No, just really grateful for the comments and the insights and the tremendous experience shared in this group. I guess I just got one reflection which didn't come up, which I think it was something that Martin said to us originally when we were talking about these ideas, is that systems often, citizens coming into this process arguably are already doing very good systems thinking, and actually another approach is to ask an interesting question, an interesting way, and then learn from the way in which they perceive the system, and particularly with this idea of agenda setting. And I was thinking about the French Assembly, where I've heard that all the tables independently started talking about big systems issues such as economic growth at the start of the process, but of course didn't have the mandate to continue that discussion.
Well, they were told it was out of scope.
Yeah,
because that wasn't the way it was being organised. I don't normally take questions, but I see Lena's got her hand up. Is that something you wanted to throw in just quickly, Lena?
Is that okay? I'll go really quick, and maybe that's
really,
not part of this
really
mandate. Okay, I just new to Knoca. Is there some kind of group, platform, Discord, Slack, a group where members can exchange further on this? Because I know, our conversation was got a little bit short, and I think some people would be really keen on sharing more experiences and learning from others. Is that something that exists?
So the only thing that exists, and I think Morten could come in, I think the only thing we've got is the Morten, what's the platform that Morten, there's a particular platform where we can share, where people can share, discuss or not? I was thinking of the social media space, but that's not the right.
No, well, we do have a LinkedIn and a Twitter X account, but yeah, that's not the best.
Okay, no, it actually isn't something we've got. And Lena, that is something we could think about trying to figure out with our colleagues at the Stockholm Resilience Centre. So, listen, if anyone has any ideas about how Knoca could take forward some of this work, please do let me know. I hope that one of the things I'd really like to get from Tim, from Sarah, and from David at some point is a sort of brain dump of what they went through, to get to where they are, how they thought about different models. But they're just about to run an assembly, so I'm not actually going to ask them to do that for a while, because that's really unreasonable. Having run assemblies myself, that is the last thing you ask somebody who's about to run an assembly to do. But it will be very useful at some point. To get their experience of using the models, but also to get their experience of having thought about using certain models and not choosing to do it, and whether or not the reflection of having gone through an assembly changes that. So I think there'll be a really interesting reflective piece. So one thing we will do is definitely return to this question after you guys have been through your process. So I'd like to, before we leave, I'd just like to advertise a couple of other things. One is another part of the system that we sometimes forget is our next event is going to be with on the inclusion of children and young people in assemblies, either in separate assemblies or in intergenerational dialogues. They are often a bit of the system that is rather neglected, and will be led in that discussion by Katie Reid, who was responsible for delivering the Children and Young People's Biodiversity Loss Assembly in Ireland, and also the engagement, young people and children's engagement in Scotland. So she's a brilliant, and she's actually co-designing this workshop with young people who she's worked with in the past. And this is part of her producing some guidance for Knoca. I'd also like to advertise that on the 5th of March, we're going to have an innovation market, or an open space, if you like, where different members of the Knoca community can present ideas they've got for taking climate assembly practice forward, whether something they've tried or an idea that they've got. And we've done this a couple of times over the last couple of years, and it's always been quite fun. If you'd like to present something, it can be just a scratchy idea that you've got, and it's an open space logic. You present your idea very briefly, and then people can come with you to a breakout group. Then get in touch with us in the next 2 or 3 weeks. That would be really great. But I want to thank, this is where, if I can remember everyone's name, I'd like to thank Tim, Sarah and David from the Stockholm Resilience Centre. I'd like to thank Claire and Martin for their great contributions. I'd like to thank my colleagues. I'd like to thank our 3 facilitators who were pulled in at the last minute, in Lena, and I've forgotten everyone's name. I've got it here. Yes, Lena, Celinda and Andreas. And I'd like to thank my colleagues at Danish Board of Technology who made this happen. This was really a group effort. It was fantastic. I've learned a lot today. I hope you have too. I've probably got more questions than I started with, but that's always a good workshop. So a real pleasure to see everybody, and thanks for coming with us on this ride. Take care, everyone.